Thank you all for coming on this freezing night. I think maybe you share with us the sense of the urgency of the question. Why does patriarchy persist? And I thought we would start by telling you, can you all hear me in the back? Oh, great. How we came to write this book. And this is a story that actually starts not with me, but with Naomi.
This is like a constant back and forth we have, because for me it really, really began with Carol. So it began with me coming to NYU back in 2014 to do a master's in law. And I decided to take this course called Resisting Injustice, which sounded very intriguing. And it was
which I teach with David Richards. David, you have to identify yourself because you were implicated in this.
Eyewitness in the audience. And really and truly, encountering this class and the work of Carol and David was my first real encounter with feminism, and the word patriarchy was really not in my lexicon up until that point. And it was really when I read The Birth of Pleasure that something in me just really kind of, it resonated. It was like suddenly a language for all the kind of experiences and questions that I had. For those who don't know, Birth of Pleasure is a book that Carol wrote in 2002.
Right.
And so just to kind of sum up the book, because the book is so crucial to kind of this book, Carol sort of juxtaposes love with versus patriarchy. And the kind of central thesis of it is that the two are in tension. Not only does patriarchy undermine our capacity to be in authentic, loving connection with each other, but that love is really the way out of patriarchy. And I read the book and I was like, so I was like, that makes a lot of sense to me, but then why? Like, if we know how to get out, if we know that love's the way out, why does it still persist? So, so we had to do a reflection paper each week, and I wrote that in my reflection paper, and as I was writing it, my thoughts kept going to the death of my father when I was 5. And I knew kind of that, like, I was like, I know why, like, love doesn't always kind of prevail, because sometimes it's terrifying. Like, when you've encountered unbearable and irreparable loss, you will protect yourself from that ever happening again by sort of avoiding intimate connection at all costs. So with that insight, I kind of posed the question, is there a connection with the persistence of patriarchy with the psychology of loss? Like, does patriarchy in some ways serve a psychological function? By requiring the sacrifice of love, it also protects us against loss. So that was, I guess, the beginning.
So basically, Naomi said that in addition to all the political forces that hold a structure like patriarchy. Let me just say, because we're using this word patriarchy, actually, when we wrote the book, we thought everyone would say, A, patriarchy no longer persists, and B, or when we started to do this work, it was an uncomfortable word. Now you can hardly pick up the New York Times without encountering the word. So we don't have to start with that. But basically, I mean, what patriarchy is it's an order of living that's based on gender. That divides human qualities into either masculine, not only human qualities, foods, colors, cars, everything is either masculine or feminine. That is a gender binary. And being a man means not being a woman or like a woman, and vice versa. and a hierarchy that privileges whatever is masculine, reason over emotion, the self over relation, anyway. So the minute you divide this, it makes it very difficult for anyone to be authentic, and so it gets in the way of relationships. So I had, kind of thought of this structure as persisting because people with power and privilege don't usually like to give up their privilege and their power, and that there were forces holding patriarchy in place. And here comes Naomi into my seminar with David and turns in this paper that starts with this amazing description. If you've looked at the book, it's in the book, of how when she was 5 years old in the death of her father, and this question, which really, I think the phrases blew my mind. Are there psychological forces that are holding patriarchy in place? Unwittingly, outside of our awareness. So we're really not aware of what we're doing. And if we're really committed to patriarchy not persisting, because let me just say that in my own writing and in my own understanding, and something I share certainly with David, the opposite of patriarchy is democracy. That is, based on a premise of equal voice, that everyone has an equal voice. And if you have equal voice, that means when conflicts arise in relationship, which is inevitable, you can address the conflicts in relationships. Whereas if you don't have equal voice, you can't. And then you get into resolving conflicts through the use of force or something of that sort. So Naomi comes along and says, is there a side? And I thought that, it's an amazing experience as a teacher when a student comes along and kind of opens one's eyes, in this case, opens my eyes to an aspect of my work. Took this work further than I had ever taken it. So, of course, my first question is, who are you? And will you hang around? And can we pursue this? And then I said, look, because Naomi comes from LSE she was a human rights lawyer. So I said, look, if you're going to talk about loss and write about loss, you should read a little psychology. So I said, you should read the work of John Bowlby, who had always fascinated me. I'd always been riveted. John Bowlby was a British psychologist, and in the 1950s, when no one was doing this, he actually started before this, during the war, when children were sent from London out into the country to Oxford, where he was teaching, to keep them safe from the bombing. And he noticed how devastated young children were when they were separated from their caretakers. And then he observed children in hospital and so forth, and he began with a filmmaker, Robertson, to film children's responses to loss. And so, as Naomi and I said to Naomi, you have to read the work of John Bowlby. And that was really the key move. We had no idea when we started, that led us to 3 discoveries that took us completely by surprise. So we want to tell you our 3 discoveries.
Okay.
You can start.
So the first discovery. So when I started reading Bowlby's work, it's 3 massive volumes, so it's an intense endeavor. But the thing about it that really, really struck me was he discovered that infants, there are 3 stages of their response to loss. And by loss, he was talking not only just physical separation, but emotional disconnection, which I think is important when we think about it in relation to our responses to patriarchy. So he discovered these 3 stages of response, and the first was protest. And that was so fascinating to us because really what it showed was that there is a resistance, which is so kind of mirrors a lot of Carol's work on kind of responses to initiations into patriarchy, that we resist the disruption in connection. But then he found, and
I was just going to say, because we start with this too in our book, is there's a 2-minute, literally 2-minute YouTube video which is actually almost unbearable to watch. So I recommend it highly to you. I keep showing it in my class, and it gets me every single time because it shows who we are as humans and where we begin, and it's called the still face experiment. Still face means a face that's not responsive. I noticed some of you are nodding, so you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, in the still face experiment, there's a mother, or you could have a father, and it doesn't matter. I mean, you can have a variety, a diversity of cultures and so forth, but you have an infant, 1 year old, and the mother is playing with the infant, and you know how that goes, cooing and playing and so forth, and the infant points and the mother looks and so forth. And then the experimenter, in this case Edward Tronick, a psychologist, instructs the mother to make her face non-responsive. So she turns away, and when she turns back, she's no longer responsive. And this is actually so fascinating because in literally a nanosecond, this 1 year old baby picks up the break in connection. And you see the baby, it looks completely puzzled. What happened? I mean, if you take this into the everyday, I mean, how many times in the everyday do we actually clock that we thought we were in connection and we feel like we've suddenly lost connection? Now, the interesting thing, the baby's first move is to move to repair the break in connection. The baby does everything that the baby had done to get the mother's response. The baby points, the baby makes sounds, and everything else, and the mother doesn't respond. This is the unbearable part. And then you see the baby's posture becomes rigid. And you see pleasure drain from the baby's body and face, and you hear this change in voice, that this cadenced relational voice, talking back and forth, suddenly turns into this really unbearable high-pitched screeching. Finally, the 2-minute end, still face period ends. I mean, it feels like forever. And the mother turns around and says, "Oh, baby," you know. The baby re-engages, and there's such a sense of relief. So what you think is, as humans, we are basically relational responsive creatures. So you have loss. The immediate response, this is Bowlby, is you protest the loss of relationship, and you move to repair it. If that move is ineffective, then, and this is Bowlby's work, what follows is first despair and then detachment. So our first discovery was a trajectory which I and my students at Harvard, when we did these studies of girls' development, girls reaching adolescence, protest when they feel they can no longer say what they're feeling and thinking and other people will be with them, that they protest this loss of connection, and this healthy resistance to losing connection turns into a political resistance because they're basically protesting the structures of patriarchy. And then that political resistance, if it's ineffective, then it's followed by despair and moves to detachment. So the trajectory, and we saw that in girls, and then we saw it in young boys between 4 and 7. So the same trajectory that Bowlby was describing as responses of human beings to loss was the trajectory that my colleagues and I had been tracing in our studies of development. And that was our first discovery.
Yeah, and then the first discovery sort of led into the second discovery, which was Bowlby identified 2 forms of detachment, what he describes as pathological responses to loss. Pathological because even though they're adaptive in kind of unresponsive environments, they prevent the forming of connections in more responsive environments. They become very rigid. So he described 2 forms of detachment. One was, he calls it various different ways: avoidant attachment, compulsive self-reliance. But essentially, it's what we think of when we think of detachment. It's the child that turns away from the caregiver that's disconnected from them. But then he also found there was a kind of inverse form of detachment, what he described as compulsive caregiving. And essentially this is where we become selfless in relationships. We do anything we can do to hold on to the connection, completely subverting and disregarding our own needs for the sake of the others. So here was our second discovery. Those two forms of detachment mirror kind of uncannily the kind of what we hold up as the honorable man, the self-reliant man who doesn't need anyone, Trump.
He's independent, he's self-sufficient, he doesn't have to rely on anyone, he's not a baby.
Not a girl, not needy. And then the kind of the compulsive caregiving, the anxious attachment, as it sometimes is called, mirrors the archetypal good woman, the selfless woman that kind of looks after everyone else's needs but completely disregards their own.
So we suddenly thought that what have been held up as ideals of femininity and masculinity, masculine honor and feminine goodness, in this binary of patriarchy, are identified by Bowlby as pathological responses to loss. In other words, responses to loss that stand in the way of being able to repair relationships. So that was our second discovery. I think if you can follow sort of our own experience, we didn't know this when we started down this path. And that then led us to our third discovery.
You go with the third.
I
feel like, yeah, you do it.
All right. The third discovery, which actually was in some ways like the most precise, which is, you see, the idea of if you want to set up a hierarchy, if you want to elevate one group of people over another group of people on the basis of race or social class or sexuality or anything, you have to undercut our relational capacities as human beings. I mean, you have to keep the person on top from feeling empathy with the person on the bottom. We saw this during the government shutdown. I mean, there was just no sense of being able to feel what it was like to not get a paycheck when you live from paycheck to paycheck. So you have to cut out the empathy from the person on top, and on the bottom you have to basically make it so that if they talk about their own experience, it's fruitless. I mean, they're not heard and so forth. So you have to undercut these relational capacities. So going back to our baby in the YouTube video, if, as now it's pretty obvious, our capacity to live in relationship with one another really depends on our ability to repair ruptures in relationship, because I think we all know this, that in the course of a day, we move in and out of connection with ourselves and in and out of connection with other people, including people we're close to. And so it's not avoiding the loss of connection, it's do you know how to repair the inevitable breaks in relationship? And what we discovered is that the initiation into these gender, scripts and codes of patriarchy, what it takes to be a, quote, real man, a man who is not girly or gay, what it takes to be a good woman, a woman who is selfless, not selfish, is that it subverts the capacity to repair ruptures in relationship. So that, for example, if men feel that to be a real man, they have to separate their mind from their emotions. They can't think about what they're feeling, so they can't feel when they, in fact, and particularly they can't feel the loss of relationship, because that would mean they're depending on somebody else, or that they're needy and so forth. So you cut out the ability of men to basically think about what they're feeling, so they lose the cues that there's been a break in relationship. And if, as several of the girls in our studies said, if I were to say what I was feeling and thinking, no one would want to be with me, my voice would be too loud. That's the quote from a valedictorian of her high school class, who was accepted by every college she applied to. It's really sort of interesting when you think she was not saying what she was feeling and thinking. No, but I mean, by her own admission, if a woman can't say what she's feeling and thinking, then you can't say, basically, you can't talk about the fact that you feel like you've lost connection with somebody. So what patriarchy does is it subverts the capacity to repair ruptures in relationship. So in that sense, it basically goes after the very capacities that are integral both for love and for living democratically, both with other people in our personal lives and also in our, public lives.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's essentially like these scripts, what they do is they shame the protest. They render it ineffective, so it essentially kind of propels that path to despair and detachment, so it kind of becomes inescapable. Yeah.
So those are our 3 discoveries. and at that point we had a sense of, we understand in some ways that patriarchy persists not only because people in power don't like to give up their power and privilege, but also because it subverts the very capacities that are essential for the things that will, for love and for democracy. And that it's serving it's serving this psychological function of undercutting those things that stand in the way, of creating and maintaining various forms of injustice and hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So we thought that's basically what we do in our book. We write our book in 2 voices because Naomi writes as Naomi and I write as me. And we thought we would end by just reading you from the last section of our book. So who starts?
You're starting, and then you start that and I jump in.
Oh, I start. Okay. So we began with a question. Why does patriarchy persist? It led us to a set of discoveries connecting the persistence of patriarchy to the psychology of loss. The persistence of patriarchy is contingent on the move from protest to despair and detachment. Otherwise, we would all be up in arms. We end with a realization. Within the very psychology that sustains patriarchy are the seeds for resistance and transformation. Because we live in what is in many ways a dark time, the anger of hope becomes a beacon, showing us a way out of despair.
For me, the key insight was that loss, which separates us, also connects us. With this realization, I began to see how, despite the forces operating against it, repair is always possible. Loss is never irrevocable.
For me, it was the realization of how precise the mechanism is that holds patriarchy in place. Like clockwork, patriarchy strikes shame at the moves to repair the ruptures that stand in the way of democracy and love. Patriarchy strikes at the heart of what makes repair possible, our sensitivity to the pain of losing connection and our ability to give voice to what we are experiencing. We kept circling back to the baby in the YouTube video to remind ourselves that these are human capacities present from the very outset of life.
We come then to the recognition that political change depends on psychological transformation, and vice versa. Leaving the psychology of patriarchy intact, we are unlikely to get rid of its politics. Leaving its politics in place, its psychology is easily mistaken for nature. Men may appear emotionally clueless, incapable of registering their own hurt or that of others. Women are deemed selfless, angels, or if not angels, then sluts.
In the process of writing together, we noticed that we had become sounding boards for one another, picking up what was often just a faint resonance and discovering that by giving voice to our doubts or questions, to our curiosity or understanding, we could call forth in the other something that had felt unsayable.
We marveled at how little it could take to shift the resonance and, by doing so, free a voice that had been tied up in confusion or held in silence. Upon reflection, This experience brings home to us the forces marshaled against this happening within the wider human community. Because, if as our work suggests, there is a fundamental tension between the human response to loss and the structures that depend on loss becoming irreparable, this is where the battle will be engaged.
Put simply, patriarchy is contingent on subverting the human capacity to repair relationship. Its hierarchy is premised on a loss of relationship and thereby on a sacrifice of love. Conversely, democracy, like love, is contingent on relationship, on everyone having a voice that is grounded in their experience. In this sense, everyone's voice is recognized as essential to the realization of democratic processes and values, and therefore both called forth and welcomed, heard and responded to, not necessarily with agreement, but with respect. Equal voice is the condition that makes it possible to work through conflicts in relationship without the use of force or by other means of domination. The relational capacities that constitute our humanity stand at the crossroads of where we have come to collectively, at this volatile intersection of democracy and patriarchy, and the question that confronts us, that confounds us perhaps more urgently now than ever before, is, which way will we go? Thank you very much. Absolutely. Please talk with us.
Start right here. Oh, great. Thank you. This is fascinating. I just want to say briefly, I actually started a very naive project about a year ago where I tried to gather some classmates around a whiteboard to see if we could essentially map patriarchy. So you've actually done the work for me, and this is some fascinating outcomes. What I'd really love to have you talk to is, it seems like patriarchy, the structure, especially the hierarchy structure, and its a need to break relationship is actually important in the ability for empire to then enact imperialistic damage on other cultures that are democratic or sustainable, or actually have communities that are healthy. It feels like there's a need for that disconnection, an ability to not to flinch, to kill that many people or parts of the ecosystem. I'd love for you to chat about that.
Do you want to talk about this? Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for that question. I mean, the minute, it's interesting to me. Once we see that as human beings, we are basically relational, responsive beings, that this is where we begin. And then you realize that throughout almost human history, people have been saying love is the answer. And then so the obvious, in a certain sense, our book comes right in there and says basically, yes, that's actually true. So what is standing in the way? What is standing in the way? And then you think, if you want to set up, whether it's an imperial system or a racist, or just economic injustice, where a small group of people have a, huge percentage of the collective wealth and the rest of the people have very little and so forth. There are all kinds of political ways that you can do this and enforce this, but you also have to nullify or stunt or blunt these human capacities. And sometimes it surprises us because in times of emergency, they come forward. There's a disaster, and suddenly people respond to each other across all these lines. So if you want to maintain these systems of injustice, you have to knock out these basic relational capacities, and then you follow. This is what I did for a number of years, is really just follow children's development, and you see they come to the point where, for example, our capacity for empathy, which depends, I mean, all the neuroscientists say this, are our ability to think about what we're feeling, because we pick up the feelings of other people, and if we think about it and so forth, that, that you have an initiation to knock that out, which opens the way to imperialism and exactly what you're talking about. And the fascinating thing to me, because I worked with children for a number of years after I wrote In a Different Voice, was just like the healthy body resists infection. I mean, that's part of our vocabulary. We have an immune system. Mine is fighting a cold right now. I mean, Anyway, the healthy psyche resists basically the loss of basic human capacities. So the healthy psyche resists the loss of human connection, the loss of connection with ourself and the loss of connection with other people. So you see this dynamic of resistance, and that's what my students and we picked it up in girls. I mean, that amazing voice of girls, that honest voice. Actually right now, I mean, I feel like even for me, who's basically an optimistic person because I study development, I'm unusually optimistic at this moment, because I see that voice coming out in some of these women now who are in the Congress. It's like the voice of the girls who I study. I mean, including not only the young, this incredibly diverse group of young women now coming into the Congress, but also my new hero, Nancy Pelosi. I mean, I just love it. When Trump starts to speak for her, she says, "Excuse me, I have a voice. I'll speak for myself. Don't tell me, about that kind of thing." So you see that resistance. So it's really that dynamic. And to say that, what patriarchy does is it brings in the whole full force of shaming, of how you can shame a boy and say he's not a real boy or not one of the boys, or you shame a girl by saying she's selfish, she's thinking about herself, not other people, and you really knock that out. Does that address your question?
I mean, the only thing that I would add in terms of the imperialism question, and having not really thought about it in that context, but one of the things that comes to my mind in thinking about it is, I think what our book does is speak to where does that urge for violence and oppression come from. And we kind of, I think it points to a model that says it's not innate. And actually, and maybe this is too simplistic to make the analogy, but when you look at kind of Bowlby's work, we didn't mention this, but I feel like it was so poignant. He describes the shift from an anger of hope to an anger of despair. And the anger of hope is anger that's designed to repair connection. That doesn't work. The anger remains, but it becomes malignant and it becomes violent. And actually, in terms of imperialism, the urge for love shifts to an urge for materialism. So I think in some ways you could think of how that psychology kind of connects to imperialism. Some thoughts.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. You gave me an opening with your comment on where does that violence come from. In my own work on relationality, I've been reading about hunter-gatherer societies. I have an optimistic message, which is 95% of our evolution. And as it turns out, the evolutionary pressures for about 1.5 million years were for communal property, lack of gender hierarchies, fairness, sharing, and what the biologists called cooperativity. The problems that we face today the good news is they're very new. They're about 8,000, 9,000 years old, which is an eye blink in terms of evolutionary development. The shift comes with sedentarism, agriculture, property concentrations that lead to hierarchies and the hoarding and grabbing of wealth, which then leads to violence. And the good news, in my thinking, is that if this is very new, 9,000 years maybe, and we spent most of our time evolving towards sharing, fairness, and cooperativity. That's a much more optimistic diagnosis for the future than if we had never lived under norms of cooperativity. And so we have actually evolutionary the capacity to go, as Carol said at the end, which way do we go? That's where we were for most of the time that we were developing. So,
thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm wondering if you could speak to attachment styles and how that would relate to your work. If you are familiar with what I'm in the relation. Okay, you got it.
Well, I think that essentially, and this is probably going to be again a little simplistic, but the three main attachment styles, let's say, like secure, avoidant, and anxious attachment. I think that kind of the model suggesting that the secure attachment is kind of the more kind of democratic way of relating in the world. The avoidant attachment is kind of has a lot of similarities.
Let me say also that I think secure attachment is a relationship in which you feel you can say what you're really thinking and feeling. I mean, that sort of brings it a little bit more down to earth, where if I say what I'm feeling and thinking, I'm not going to lose the relationship. So I think that just means a secure attachment is a relationship that's actually a relationship. No, I mean, I'm serious. Because otherwise, if I'm not saying what I'm feeling and thinking, then I'm not in relationship. The interesting thing to me is, the number of girls, I mean, and these were the more the shrewder or the more articulate, perhaps, girls, who basically saw this. I mean, who were being told, look, if you want to have relationships, if you want to do well, if you want to be chosen, if you want to blah, 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 just don't say what you're feeling and thinking. Learn to say what people want you to say and so forth. Don't know what you know. I mean, we see this in the Me Too movement right now. And the girls who say, if you're asking me to basically divorce myself from my own experience in order to have relationships, that's not really relationships. So I really think the attachment styles, I would love to rename it as the secure attachment means an actual relationship. And it goes downhill from there. Talking about the avoidant.
Oh yeah, just so the avoidant attachment. I think this was one of our discoveries. The avoidant attachment really mirrors what we see as what we've held up as masculinity, like moving out of relationship, becoming increasingly self-reliant. It's been held up as like an attainment, and what we're saying is actually it's a move out of relationship. And according to Bowlby, it's a pathological response to loss. The anxious attachment, also sometimes called compulsive caregiving, in Bowlby's work, similarly we're saying is also a move out of relationship, often not seen that way though. Like women, the selfless woman is seen as very relational, but actually, like Carol says to Iris, the girl that says, what does she?
She says, if I were to say what I was feeling and thinking, no one would want to be with me, my voice would be too loud. And then she says to me, but you have to have relationships. And I said to her, but if you're not saying what you're feeling and thinking, then where are you in these relationships? And it was clear to me she saw it. I want to say, apropos what Naomi was talking about avoidant attachment, I was amazed because, when Naomi was reading Bowlby, I started reading Bowlby again with her, or I read Naomi's reading of Bowlby, and he was talking about children, and the ones who are doing, detachment, are replacing people with objects. Mm-hmm. I mean, literally, and you think about our obsessed culture. I don't need people, I have all these things. Mm-hmm. They're not, my iPhone will never leave me.
Hi. So I had a thought. I'm a therapist, and my thought was, all I do is treat the anger of despair. Because it seems like people, it either turns inward, substance use, eating disorders, mental illness, the whole DSM, or outward, and we get a lot of violence. And I'm just treating people who have gone through this system and been broken by it, and that's great. I help people, but what do we do practically to prevent or going forward? What do we?
I think in some ways it's about learning to listen to protest in a different way. Like the therapy example is a really good one, right? Because traditionally protest by a patient is seen as resistance, which kind of like then you get like Dora, she leaves the therapy. So actually that's like, how do therapists learn to engage that kind of anger of hope in the relationship? It's about not pathologizing it when you hear it. It's not, and I think just on a broad level, it's about not hearing assertive women as bitches, not hearing emotional men as like sissies. I think it's a kind of a retuning of our ears in a way.
How do we do that systemically?
Oh, good question. Good question. I turn it to the audience.
Oh, but but I think it is happening. I really do think, I think this was all a little bit kind of under the surface. I think right now the whole thing is playing out on the surface, both sides of it. I mean, you have, the election of an unabashedly, unapologetically patriarchal man as president. I think for many people that was shocking. I mean, how is Trump patriarchal? First of all, David and I write about this in our book, Darkness Now Visible. It's like that's his lens. Everything is seen in terms of the gender binary. Little Marco, he's not a real man. Crooked Hillary, she's not a good woman. Every single thing is seen in terms of gender. And the thing about the patriarch is the patriarch has authority by virtue of the fact that he is the patriarchy. He is the winner, not the loser, on top, strong, not weak. You can hear this gender thing. So Trump, when he says, it's true because I say it, and to a Democratic ear, that's kind of bizarre, What do you mean it's true because you said it, or I. But that is within patriarchy. It's like the voice of the father is the voice of the law. It's the voice of morality and the voice of law. So, basically. So then I think to your question, yes, you can see that playing out, but as that now is explicit, there's no apology for it, there's no hiding it, it's out in the open. Now here comes the resistance.
Yeah, it's reawakened.
Those amazing young women, Ocasio-Cortez, they said, you can't show yourself dancing? She says, what? I'll make another video of myself dancing in front of my office. You can't, it's like that. Or the woman who said, can I say it here? Yeah. I think of her as the motherfucker lady. Because I think she's amazing. And Nancy Pelosi, instead of sort of chastising her for using this language, she said, well, my generation, we don't really talk this way. I'm a grandmother. But that's how people talk, she said. And she's not hurting anybody, and I'm not in the censoring business, and so forth. So there you see the resistance. And, if we had world enough and time, I would tell you, my friend Randy here would love me to tell you, that I wrote a paper this fall about having seen 3 movies that were made by straight men. And if these movies had been made by women or by gay men, everybody would have said what? But basically, straight men saying, we need a different voice. And, we really need an ethic of care. And these are mainstream movies. So I really think we're living in a way, in a way, it's a tremendously volatile time, in the sense that it could really go either way. But it's also really a kind of amazing time because, you can see it. You can't listen to television, you can't pick up the newspaper without just seeing it. And you just sort of listen to, is this a kind of is the lens a gendered lens? Who's a real man? Who's a good woman? You know, this hierarchy. Or are we talking about democracy, which is where are these voices of these people who we haven't listened to? And I mean, again, I think the government shutdown was really a revelation for a lot of people because there were a lot of voices that hadn't been heard before, and we heard them. I mean, they were out in the open.
Another question here? The patriarch didn't listen.
Because he's the patriarch. I mean, but you see, that's it. But a lot of people did listen, and he had to back down because a lot of people listened. And a lot of the people in Congress, including some of the Republicans, listened. I mean, I'm not saying, there it is. You know,
Can you hear me back?
this person has a microphone.
Loud voice.
Can we go with the microphone?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's been waiting for, yeah. I didn't. And then we'll go to her and then to you. Fine.
Well, this is just to bring out and underscore something that is implicit in what you've been saying anyway. And that is that two qualities that I think are common to both love and democracy are equality, of course, but also difference. If you have equality without difference, the emphasis is on sameness, conformity, meeting the expectations of something that gets set up as a norm. But if you have difference without equality, then you have hierarchy, you have who's better than the other, you have racism, you have gender bias. So you need both for democracy, and you need both for love. With equality, the mode is identification. And that's one aspect of empathy, of course. But with difference, I think you need something more than that, which is curiosity. Interest in that which is not you, which is not the familiar, which takes you toward something unknown, and from which you grow. So you need both. Love without one or the other is not good. Democracy without one or the other isn't really democracy.
I like that way of putting it.
Yeah, I do too.
Just to kind of add to and organize some, I'm also a therapist, some of what's being spoken here. When you talk about these points of being initiated into the patriarchy, I'm just thinking in the back of my mind, what would a counter initiation look like? And would it be developmental? Would it be for boys at 5 and 7 and 15 and girls in this pre-pubescent stage? And also just sitting here thinking about the protest and repair. And when I'm doing what I'm doing in my office all day, and is, when people have been faced with these ruptures, these serious attachment ruptures that we're all living in, culturally imposed attachment ruptures and personal attachment ruptures, it takes an enormous physiological presence to respond to that protest, to cause a change in the relational system. And I guess what I'm struck by is that your core work is around listening. And I wonder, when you're in that state of listening and observing to these voices, if there might be some physiological state that you fall into that allows change. And is there a way that we can create that kind of listening collectively, or maybe it's happening and I don't recognize it, but I'm just kind of naming these and asking how it might pull together some of the pieces here.
We both think it's a great question. I mean, which means I don't think there's a simple answer, but I think you're absolutely right, and I think there is a physiological thing to it. And I mean,
And I think actually you're highlighting that listening is both cognitive and physiological. I feel like it ties in so much with Carol's always use the word voice, that because what voice is not just language, it's embodied. So I think it makes a lot of sense that it would require a listening that was also embodied in that way.
So I think the gentleman who I interrupted, I apologize, really gave the positive to my negative, which is patriarchy and dictatorship and autocracy are what we were facing before the election. And I think now there's some hope.
Yeah. Yes, I agree.
So
Yeah.
that was what I was.
It's a good place to end.
Does your work address the role of religion in the persistence of patriarchy? When I think of original texts and fundamentalist approaches to religion, and how that seems to be the ultimate patriarchy. If you have a God who's a male, and you have a pope who can't be a woman, and you have, I'm just curious if you've thought about or written about religion's role in the persistence of patriarchy.
It's such a great question. Yeah, of course. It's so, God the Father. It's sort of amazing in a way that the word patriarchy is not used all the time in relate. So I'm sitting here thinking that I'm writing a novel that has a central character whose name, because if you write novels, names of the characters sort of come to you. They're not sort of thought out. And this character happens to be named Eve. So you can think, so where does this lead me, right? It leads me obviously back to the story of Adam and Eve, and I was actually astonished because it led me actually to reread the book of Genesis. And I can go down that path with you completely about God the Father, and aren't these religions all patriarchal, and and everything else. So I read the story of Adam and Eve, and I'll just tell you one thing, because I could obviously talk about this all night. I'd always thought of Eve as or heard her described as the dupe of the serpent. That the serpent comes and says, whatever. God says one thing, the serpent says the other, and she follows the serpent, which is the wrong choice, and therefore she's responsible, and it's all her fault forever and ever. And that certainly is along with the patriarchal narrative. When I reread the book of Genesis, I was really startled. Because actually what the serpent does is the serpent comes in and says, can you eat of all the trees in this garden? And Eve says, all except the one in the center, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and if you eat that, you will die. The serpent says you won't die, and the serpent leaves. So she's been told now two things. One is you will die, one is you won't die. What do you think the next sentence is in the book of Genesis? I was stunned. She looked at the tree. This woman, and saw that it was good for food and pleasing to the eye, a tree to be desired to make one wise. And she took the fruit and ate it. And of course, nothing happens. And she gave it to the person she loves, which in this case was her husband. So she acts on her own perception. So it started to occur to me, maybe there are, even within the religion, there are stories, there are different stories, human stories, because that sort of, that struck me as almost a quintessential woman's story. You see something, you look, you act on your own perception, it's good for food, you try it, it's okay, you give it to the person you love. It's sort of such an everyday woman, you know what I mean? So that even within this tradition, there is the resistance. And in a way it makes sense, because if we're right in this book, that there's a tension built in between who we are as humans and these orders of living that we have set up, then yes, you can get autocracy and fascism and everything else, and we certainly are aware of that threat right now. It's so in our midst, it's rather shocking. But you also always have the resistance, and that's the optimism of our book, is that, the seeds of resistance are within us. And so that's what I would say. I think the religions are actually much more complicated than the simple thing of, well, God the Father and the Pope can't be a woman, and so forth.
Hi. I really enjoyed reading your book. I think that it's crucial for young women, especially in my generation, to understand the implications of patriarchy. So I ask, what advice would you give to young girls who resist and protest the patriarchy in a way that they are not labeled nasty or angry women?
Well, first of all, you are going to be labeled nasty and angry women. So that's the place to start. But the question is, what's your response? And that's where I think we now have, in our House of Representatives, including the Speaker, we have models of resistance. When whoever started to shame Ocasio-Cortez for dancing, what did she do? She made a video of herself dancing in front of her congressional office. And when Trump, started to speak over Nancy Pelosi, she said, don't characterize the strength of my position. I'm the leader of a party that has just won a major electoral victory. So it's like, it's not letting that attack take your voice. And what's exciting to me right now is, again, without being naive about this, which I'm really not, I think it's extraordinary that we have resistance in the halls of power.
The only other thing that I would add, based on my own experience, is that you search for resonance. Like, you search for those relationships where that voice won't be shamed, because I think it's impossible to do it alone. I feel like this book is kind of testament to that.
Well, when we talked about our writing process, that was amazing, because we found that with each other, and we each ended up writing things. Can we describe those moments? Or
it's like, it's all like, it's both. It's like a finish. Like, I feel like at some points it would be like the other person would finish a sentence, and at the other points it was more like you're saying, it's equality and difference. It was like disagreeing at some points, but that was challenging and made you kind of get to the finer point of what you really meant.
Yeah, and we were able to say to each other, that doesn't make any sense to me. Mm-hmm. And then instead of the other person sort of retreating and thinking, oh, well, it probably doesn't make any... because, I'll certainly say, I still struggle with what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's probably a woman in the world who doesn't struggle with it. If I say that, people will think I'm angry. Well, actually, I might be,
Can you talk about any society or culture worldwide that you feel is very democratic, that gives voice to both men and women?
Because you want to move there. Iceland. Honestly, I think there are people who do this kind of work, and I'm not one of them. I don't think Naomi is either, but who really look across cultures for those that are more and less democratic. And there are real differences, and it does make a difference. And what Naomi just said before, and I just want to underscore because it's such a key point, is that voice depends on resonance. And the experience, I think, for both of us tonight is finding so much resonance here among this audience that it's becoming easier and easier for us to speak. Mm-hmm. And, if you start to speak and you feel that what's coming back at you is some distorting thing and you don't feel that people are hearing, then you sort of lose it. So, yeah, I think there are places that are more or less democratic. And I think there are places even, within our own country. This bookstore.